Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on Hub Dialogues again. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for writing this, your first book.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
A sad topic in many ways, though, right? Like, there's a lot in here in terms of how our country is struggling. You go as far to say that Canada is not a democratic country?
Yeah, I mean, if by many of the standard definitions of what comprises a democracy, we fall short of them. We observe all of the rituals. We have all the forms of a democracy. Obviously, certain things we live up to the standard. So, when we have elections, we have paper ballots that work very well, and nobody's standing over you while you mark your ballot, and nobody's buying your vote, and nobody's, at least not literally, and nobody's going to threaten you. So all these kinds of things. So if you want to say, yeah, our elections are not rigged, we're what a wonderful democracy we are, fine. But anything beyond that, by the standards of, do the people that we elect to represent us actually represent us in any meaningful fashion? Does the parliament that we elect look remotely like what we voted for? Are there the checks and balances that we think we have in the system? Is the government accountable to Parliament in the way that we were all brought up to understand? To the party, do the internal workings of parties resemble anything resembling a democracy? On a lot of these things, you'd say no. So I think it's an open question whether we are meaningfully a democracy or just simply a ceremonial democracy.
So your standards are higher than the economists who say we're the 14th best democracy in the world then.
Again, when you look at the standards that go into that, it's bare minimum stuff. And hallelujah, absolutely. We're ahead of scores of countries around the world that aren't democracies even in form. But we should aspire a little higher than that. And there are countries that are doing it better than we do. One of the things I try to get into the book is there's a tendency, first of all, whenever you question anything to do with Canada, people sort of say, well, this is Canada, everything's great here. But secondly, there's a tendency to say, oh, it's always been this way. I've been hearing this for years, or every country has its problems, we're not that bad. And so what I've tried to do in the book, wherever I can, is to show, no, things have actually gotten worse, measurably worse than they were in decades past. And on a lot of pretty standard criteria, some of them quite quantifiable, we come up way short of a lot of other democratic countries.
Are we a corrupt country?
Not particularly, no. I mean, it's not unknown here, but by international standards, we're pretty good. We're pretty good by that standard.
So we should be setting our eyes domestically, focusing on ourselves here. And one of the things you say, another thing that I think would surprise people, that you say the Prime Minister's powers are close to dictatorial in nature.
Oh, and I'm hardly the first one to say it. I mean, Jeffrey Simpson, 20-odd years ago, wrote a book called The Friendly Dictatorship. He was talking about Jacques Chrétien. At the time, we thought we'd never seen anything like the degree of centralization of power in the office of the Prime Minister. Well, since then, things have actually gotten worse still by common consensus. Every Prime Minister comes in promising to clean up the mess left by the previous bunch, and every one of them decides he's going to go even further. But yeah, when you look at the powers, first of all, the powers of any Westminster Prime Minister, Britain, Australia, et cetera, are pretty strong. It's designed to be a strong Prime Minister system. Particularly when you add to that first past the post, and not all Westminster systems are first past the post, but when they are, that means that they don't have to worry about forming coalitions. They can sneak through with a 38% majority, and they have from that day forward very little to worry about in Parliament. But then you take the additional things in our system. One is the power of party leaders in general. To decide the fates of ordinary members of Parliament, members of caucus. The Prime Minister enjoys all of those powers as the leader of a party, and they're considerable. Then you add to that the powers of the government relative to the Parliament. And in our system, we've allowed the government we've allowed a lot of prerogatives and rules of the game, et cetera, that in other parliaments are decided either by the Speaker of the House or by a vote of the Parliament, sometimes a supermajority of the Parliament. In our system, they've simply devolved into the government, which of course means the Prime Minister. So he has all of those powers as well, on top of which he has all the powers of appointment that are unrivaled across the democratic world. Again, Prime Ministers typically have a lot of powers of appointment. I don't know there's very many countries where the Prime Minister also appoints all of the members of the upper house. In addition to all the members of the Supreme Court and every deputy minister of every department and every head of every crown corporation and the head of the armed forces and the head of the RCMP and right down the line, including in our system, in Canada, if we call it a system, the Prime Minister appoints the chiefs of staff of every Minister of Cabinet.
Little spies or birds. For
never
him
heard
to
of such a
see.
thing. There was one incident in Britain at the height of the Boris Johnson mania when Johnson, in a fit of craziness, his people told Rajiv Javid, his Chancellor of the Exchequer, who they were feuding with, well, we're going to appoint your senior advisors. And Javid resigned on the spot as Chancellor of the Exchequer and said, no self-respecting minister would accept such treatment. Well, it's become standard in Canada. So he has all these powers, very little oversight, check on it. They did a survey, I footnote in the book, several hundred political scientists around the world, which head of government has the most powers. Canada came out on top. And that was some years ago.
They rely desperately on he or she, the Prime Minister. He doesn't really rely on them at all. He can do what he wants. Like the PMO, you say, has grown to something like 121 people?
Yeah.
How is this possible?
Well, it's a good question. It began more or less in the days of Pierre Trudeau. That's when the sort of imperial prime minister really started to take root. Trudeau, being the intellectual he was, I suppose, had less use for lesser mortals and decided he would surround himself with his own advisors, his own personal advisors, rather than the advisors that he gets through cabinet, though he chooses the cabinet himself as well. But the difference is when you have a strong cabinet, and by strong cabinet, I mean a small cabinet. We've allowed cabinets to get to the size of like 40 ministers in recent times. Mark Carney's cut it back to 29. It's still one of the largest cabinets in the world by a country mile. The average in the OECD is 19.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say about half.
And anybody who's been in any committee knows past about 12 members, it becomes really hard to get anything done. So think of 40 people around the table. I'm told they are literally on a timer, right? You have 30 seconds, go. So the cabinet as a deliberative body has ceased to function really. Ministers themselves, when there's 40 ministers, each of them is accordingly smaller in any importance. They're there to be placeholders for particular demographic groups or regions, et cetera. But when you have a small cabinet with big deal ministers, then if you're a prime minister, that's one of the constraints on your power. They are the instrument of your power, but there are also constraints upon it in that you've got to keep them all in the tent. And Cabinet Minister A, who's a big deal and may not agree with this policy I'm about to propose, and I got to think about that and balance it off with Cabinet Minister B. In a functioning cabinet system, that's one of the things prime ministers have to take into account. When cabinet has become, as Donald Savoy has called it, a focus group for the prime minister, that's much less of a concern.
I think you note in the book there haven't really been any pictures taken of the 40-plus cabinets.
I could not find any.
Because they can't fit in a room. You've got to rent out a whole basketball arena.
You can find lots of pictures of the Italian cabinet, the British cabinet, the French cabinet. I include in the book a picture of the British cabinet, which has 22 ministers. If you look at that picture, you go, okay, they can probably just barely get things done with 22 people crowded around the table. Now double it, and that's what you're talking about in Canada.
Let's just talk about access when it comes to cabinet ministers to the big boss, the prime minister. Stéphane Dion was Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2015 to 2017, I believe. He apparently had one-on-one meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau that lasted 5 minutes, and it was his firing.
Yep.
How is this possible?
And that's a common story. If you read the memoirs of 3 very prominent ministers in the Trudeau government, Trudeau the Younger, Marc Garneau, the Foreign Affairs Minister after Dion, Bill Morneau, the Finance Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Justice Minister and Attorney General. Okay, she got more meetings than she would like with the Prime Minister because he was trying to basically, bare knuckle her into doing something she was not supposed to be doing, and that is to say interfering in a criminal prosecution. But mostly what comes through in these memoirs is, I could not get a meeting with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister seemed absolutely uninterested in anything I had to say. I felt I had no influence whatsoever on his policies. Or if I did, the minute they conflicted with his political agenda, out they went. Morneau, at one point when he was preparing a budget, I forget where I heard this, may not have been in his memoirs, but I was told that he was told, send off your concerns in an email and we'll see that the Prime Minister sees them. This is the Finance Minister of Canada.
So if the Prime Minister is now sort of a mascot in a way, and these are descriptions we've been told, and the cabinet ministers are spokespeople, who's running the country?
Well,
who's formulating the policy and governing this place?
Well, absolutely. And that was one of the things that was different and arguably worse with Trudeau versus Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper, everybody knew, was a control freak. but he was also, pretty big brain, read every memo. You don't want a prime minister micromanaging, but if he's going to do that, you'd hope he's got a capacious brain and ability and work ethic, et cetera. You did not hear the same things about Justin Trudeau. There was a very strong sense that the people who were micromanaging things was not the prime minister; it was the prime minister's staff, his chief of staff, and various advisors. That's to some extent a complaint in general about prime ministers' offices, but it's been taken once again to an extreme under Justin Trudeau. Was taken under to an extreme. It's one thing that the guy who was at least notionally elected would have this vastly over-centralized power. That's a problem in itself. But for all that power to be centralized in a couple of unelected officials, and you saw that in the Justin Trudeau government. One of the crazy things about this is, every basic management book will tell you the larger the organization, the more you have to delegate authority. You can't do it all. You could run everything when it was a mom and pop shop, but once you're a large corporation, you got to delegate. We've done the opposite in Canada. The larger government has become, the more things it has taken on, the more voluminous its files, the more that we've tried to run everything out of the Prime Minister's office and the advisors that they hire. And you certainly saw under the Justin Trudeau government a very strong sense that they were overwhelmed by things. They were trying to route every single decision through those same 5 people, and everything was getting held up and nothing was getting done.
Can we dwell on this idea of, and I think Mike Duffy called them the kids in short pants, the 20-somethings, younger than you and I, who are basically unelected and are putting together all the communiques that these ministers are there standing up in the House, reading clumsily off a sheet of paper every single day. Objectively, we can say when it comes to political performance in the House, the bar is extremely low in this country.
Yeah. So
these ministers are standing up and reading these things essentially crafted by, young staffers who are putting words in their mouth.
Well, not just ministers, everybody. So the hilarious thing in question period is, when the questions are asked from the government benches, and the questions, of course, this is a time-honored, unfortunate tradition, is the questions are, will the minister enlighten the House about what wonderful things the government is doing on X, Y, and Z files? Well, the question will have been written for the MP asking it by people in party central command. The answer will have been written by it, and I'm prepared to believe it's the same person on both sides. I don't know that for a fact, but it's preposterous. And the degree to which the party headquarters has taken control of everything MPs say or do, not just ministers, but everything ordinary MPs do, who are supposed to be on the government side somewhat independent of the government. They're not in the cabinet. They're ordinary members of parliament. They're supposed to have some notional sense of, still being a watchdog on the government, though that's, long been attenuated. But yeah, it's not. We used to talk about what ferocious party discipline there was in the voting, and that is true. So in Canada, the Samara Center did a study I think it was during the first Trudeau majority government, 2015, 2019. 19 MPs voted with their party 99.6% of the time. Orders of magnitude greater than any other relevant democracy, and it's party discipline's been a concern in all democracies, but we've just, as usual, taken it far greater than anybody else. But as the political scientist Alex Marland emphasizes, it's not just about voting discipline anymore. It's message discipline, and it's not just everything they say in Parliament. Every member's statement that they make, oftentimes will have been written for them, or certainly they'll have had to get approval for it. Questions they ask in Parliament, debates in Parliament. It's also outside of Parliament. It's the tweets that they put up on social media, the speeches they make in their local riding association. They will all have been either written for them or carefully reviewed. Nobody is allowed to go off message even for a second. And this is unparalleled and unprecedented.
Let's stay on this idea of youth. Humor me with this. We talk about that Samara, those exit interviews done with MPs. And when you read them, it's quite astounding. You get the sense that a lot of their work, especially if you're a backbench MP, is very bureaucratic. You're shuffling papers around. You're helping people fill out forms around immigration, EI. Could it and I'm being a bit cheeky here, but could a student intern not do some of these jobs?
Of course they could.
So the jobs our MPs are doing right now, in terms of skill level, a student intern could do in many ways.
Well, this is the pathetic part is This is the defense that MPs offer when they get shirty about this, about being told that they don't have any real role or responsibility anymore. This is the defense they offer is, yeah, but I do a lot of good work in my constituency. That's what it's really all about. What they're saying is they don't really have any role left for them as legislators. So we've already talked about how they vote the party line 99.6% of the time. We've talked about how the debates in every statement they make is written for them. Committee work, which is supposed to be the crown and the jewel in the crown of parliamentary work, is entirely controlled by the party apparatus. So the committees, and if committees were of any use, when you throw 800-page omnibus bills at them, they've basically ceased to function in any important way of providing oversight of legislation. What am I leaving out? Voting, proposing legislation. We pass maybe 2 or 3 private members' bills in a year in this country. Most MPs go through their entire career will never get to propose legislation, or certainly won't get it passed. So all of the things that would identify them as legislators have basically fallen by the side. So they say, yeah, we do all this important work in the constituency, as you say, writing letters to immigration, which is, first of all, as you mentioned, something that could be done by your average high school student. And secondly, is basically influence peddling. I mean, when you think about it, in most countries,
you want that watermark at the bottom.
In most countries, it would be regarded as being kind of unseemly for you to be able to say, I'm going to get preferential treatment from the bureaucracy based on who I know, because I've got some powerful or not so powerful, but I've got some MP who can sign off on my paper, and I'll get to the head of the line. That's not supposed to be how the system works. It's a little that doesn't get enough attention. Is the whole premise is kind of seedy.
Reading your book, reading those exit interviews, my experience, I worked for the Canadian Association of Former Parliamentarians, speaking to backbench MPs. The word that is ringing in the back of my mind when I hear these things is, this is kind of a humiliating job in many ways, in terms of what it's been reduced to. Is that the word that you hear ringing in your head?
Yeah, if they viewed it that way themselves, and that's an interesting question. There's a certain amount of self-selection that goes on. I mean, it's fairly well known now how little power MPs have, how much they are basically step and fetchits for the party
and the
leaders.
sycophancy that you have to practice in terms of the leader.
If you go into it now, if you don't have your eyes open, you should. Now, maybe so. Point one is there's a certain amount of self-selection that people kind of sign up for this. Maybe they had ideas that they would be the exception and they would shake things up and they would do things their way. If so, they get either weeded out in the nomination process, which is generally speaking tightly controlled by the party. So they probably will not be given the nomination. If they survive that, then they'll get it beaten out of them when they get to Parliament. And it won't just be by the party apparatchiks, by the higher-ups who have all of these powers over them in terms of if they ever want to sit on a committee, if they ever want to go on a travel, if they want to have a decent office, if they ever want to have a chance of being a critic or a minister or even a parliamentary secretary. Any prospect of advancement is entirely in the hands of the party apparatus and the party leader. So that's a strong incentive to stay in line. But if that weren't enough, there's the peer pressure of your fellow MPs. So maybe you have a very strong conscience and you're willing to sacrifice your career prospects for a principle, but it takes a certain amount of extra strength to be able to say, I'm going to sacrifice other people's careers for this principle. And they're going to be rounding on you and saying, you and your precious conscience, don't ruin this for the rest of us. And that is a very powerful thing. When Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott left cabinet. Jane Philpott resigned. Question about what exactly happened with Jody Wilson-Raybould, but they left cabinet, were forced out of cabinet. Trudeau then, that wasn't enough for him, so he drummed them out of caucus, decreed that the leader, of course, has this power in Canada to expel them from caucus.
And what did the MPs do
when
they heard that?
The fellow MPs stood and cheered. You might have expected them, if you were naive, you might have said their fellow caucus members might have said this is a terrible abuse of power by the party leader. No, they stood and cheered because that's the mindset. So they've colluded in their own servitude, MPs have. They've become part of the problem. They see themselves as basically the leader's employees and that their job is basically to do whatever the leader tells them, no matter how humiliating and degrading it is. And until and unless you can change that attitude, unless you can get MPs themselves to see themselves in some more enlightened and empowered light, not much else is going to happen.
Let's go back to the leader for a sec here. No Canadian, you write, no Canadian Prime Minister has been driven out of office due to scandal since Sir John A. Macdonald. But you do write, and I caught this, you say that at least 2 probably deserve to be behind bars. Name names here. Which prime ministers deserve to be behind bars?
I'm not getting it.
No, but you just throw that out in your book, and you don't say it.
I'm going to show a modicum of self-preservation here. I would certainly say there have been prime ministers in modern times whose acts, I think, if examined in a court of law, would be judged wanting, would be found guilty of some sort of criminal offense. So I don't think I need to name names. It's a narrow list of how many prime ministers we had in recent times.
Okay, I'll just have them looming over you in the back here just to intimidate you. Separating from the scandal, we talk about all the immense powers, all-seeing, all-knowing PMO and Prime Minister. How has Mr. Carney been doing so far as it relates to not being that Saruman sort of eye going?
So far, it certainly looks, certainly in terms of the powers of government versus Parliament, looks like much of a muchness. If you look at these bills they brought in, C2, C4, and C5 particularly, all of them omnibus bills, yoking together completely disconnected pieces of legislation. Not as long as some omnibus bills, but C4, you're yoking together. What is it? The tax cut that he promised during the election, and I think what the other thing it yoked together with was, a thing exonerating the parties from having to obey federal or provincial privacy legislation because they're in danger of losing a case in British Columbia where the parties would have to subject themselves to provincial privacy legislation. Those 2 things have nothing to do with each other. The bills themselves contain a number of quite draconian measures that seem to have been cooked up in Ottawa and been lying around waiting for somebody to pass them. I don't see any evidence that he's treating Parliament with any greater seriousness than previous prime ministers. It's early days. He's only had the Parliament only sat for a couple of weeks before it rose again. This is another thing. Our Parliament sits for fewer days than most, not all, but most parliaments. We're going to sit, I think, in total this year, 73 days, which is, I think, the shortest since the 1930s.
The 1930s?
Yeah. The British House will sit for something like 150 days, so twice as often this year as our House will, at a time when supposedly we're in a great national crisis. This is the thing, in the middle of this existential threat from this crazy president to the south of us, Parliament sat dark for close to 6 months. And I don't think anybody noticed or cared. And that, to me, is a comment in and of itself. When there was a world war on, pretty busy time for governments, you could make the same arguments, we can't afford to be. No, Parliament met, Parliament debated, Parliament voiced people's fears and concerns precisely because there was a war on, precisely because there was a crisis on. People looked to their parliaments in those days to represent them in that regard. And now, to make the suggestion, shouldn't Parliament be sitting at this moment? People looked at you like you had 2 heads. What would Parliament do? That's one of the vicious circles that we're in. Is Parliament has become so irrelevant that nobody can muster the wherewithal to say why they should be upset by this. That we've forgotten why Parliament should matter to us at all.
Well, one of the defenses was, at least from the Liberal Party, was like, let us sort ourselves out,
yeah.
And then.
You get the sense of what the priorities are. Yeah, you, the people, just go away and
hold
leave
tight,
us.
yeah.
Hold tight. We don't need to have any representation while we sort through the internal machinations of choosing a new leader by the bizarre process by which we allow the parties to choose their leaders, which is not by a vote of the people they actually lead, the members of the caucus, but by some other group that they assemble hastily just for the day, made up of instant members signed up by the busload, children, people who are not Canadian citizens. That's who chooses our party leaders, and in this case chose the Prime Minister in Canada, and again, we've become so habituated to it, we don't recognize how abnormal it is.
Mm-hmm. We'll never forgive them for moving from delegated conventions to one member, one vote.
Well,
will we?
Well, one member, one vote is worse than delegated. Delegated conventions, in my opinion, are worse than having the caucus choose it. One of the themes I try to express in the book is democracy is not just what happens on election day, but every day in between. So people, when you talk about let's have the caucus choose it rather than the members of the party, people think, oh, having the broad membership is more democratic because there's more people involved. And of course, it's not just the party members; it's the members plus all the people that they sign up in the course of the race, who've had nothing to do with the party before, and I promise you have nothing to do with it after. They just sign up for that one day to involve themselves in that vote. Well, is it more democratic? The practical result is the party leader, having been chosen by that process, is accountable to nobody. From that day forward, he owes nobody anything. He certainly doesn't owe the caucus anything, and he can basically thumb his nose at them for the next 4 years. I mean, if he pushes it too far, maybe someday the caucus might somehow find the way to take him down. But since there's no rules and no process, and nobody knows what the benchmarks are, nobody wants to be the first to stick their head above the parapet. What happens is, you have to be in an absolute calamitous situation before the caucus will take on the leader. It's a really big deal. Well, that's not a particularly democratic system. If you have a leader who can be removed by the caucus and replaced by the caucus, then that means the leader has to be very accountable.
There's a fire burning underneath
very solicitous
them,
to those about those MPs' concerns every single day. Now, one bright spot is we've moved part of the way towards that because of Michael Chong's Reform Act, which was much watered down from its original intent. And one of the things that was watered down was it only applies if the party caucus votes after each election to have the powers that it would confer upon them apply to it. But one party has done that, and that's the Conservative caucus.
Hasn't the Bloc done it too, or no?
They certainly didn't vote. There may be another party that's assumed one of the other 4 powers. I don't want to get into the weeds on this, but the really important power was the power to remove the leader.
Bring down
Only
the
the
leader,
Conservatives have voted for that. And sure enough, after they did that, they brought down Aaron O'Toole, and they recently voted to arm themselves with that power vis-a-vis Pierre Poilievre. So you better believe Pierre Poilievre is being very, very concerned in a way that he wasn't a few months ago when he thought he was headed for the prime ministership. He's being very solicitous, I would bet, of Conservative MPs' concerns. That's the way the system should work. That shouldn't be a novelty. That should be how it is.
That should be a highlight. You aren't kind to the Liberals, Andrew. You write, looking back historically at Canada, one of the major reasons our democracy has deteriorated is because, in your words, of the historic dominance of one party. Why do the Liberals hold a fair amount of blame here in terms of some of this stuff festering?
Well, to be fair, I'm not sure I'm blaming the Liberals so much as the situation, because I think the Conservatives have also contributed to this. But the problem is one-party rule, or as Richard Gwynne called it, 1.5-party rule. So the problem is that we've had these long periods of Liberal dominance punctuated by
87 of the last 129 years they've governed.
Right. So punctuated by brief intervals of Conservative rule. So I think my hypothesis is that things are let slide under the Liberals because they can. They're in power for so long. They're so unused to anybody challenging them. They can take shortcuts and nobody's going to blow the whistle on, or if they do, nothing will happen. And it just becomes a self-reinforcing thing where the longer they're in, the more they're able to get away with this stuff. So that's the Liberals' contribution. The Conservatives' contribution is they get in and they say, you know what, everything's stacked against us. The media are against us, the bureaucracy's against us, the judiciary is against us. So we have to take shortcuts. We've got to push through everything we can while we're here, because we don't know how long we're going to last.
There's a clock ticking in the background as soon as you arrive.
So Liberals do it because they can. The Conservatives do it because in their minds they must. It's a one-way ratchet. It means that it just continually gets worse. So one of the things we really need as a kind of a meta reform is we need contestable politics. When either party or all parties before every election can either see themselves losing or winning, If therefore, you happen to win government, you can't be assured how long you'll be in government. Maybe you'll be in opposition before you know it. Then you're going to be a little bit more concerned about the rights of the opposition because you might be the opposition. So we need more contestable politics if we're going to have more, adherence to the rules and more accountability in our politics.
Do you think there were Liberal MPs in the last election who believed that they were going to win this thing
Well,
when it started? That they weren't going to be sent to the wilderness?
No, I mean, that was a very unusual election, that 2 months before the election, everybody agreed they were doomed. And then halfway through the election, it looked like they were heading for a massive majority. And then we got, I think, the result was probably most appropriate, which was a tentative minority, that the people were fed up with the previous government, but they weren't quite ready to hand the keys over to the Conservatives.
You mentioned solutions. I want to get into that because one of the things I like about you is you're a guy who has hope. You think that this can change. You somehow think this can get better. You aren't completely cynical when it comes to this. People are going to read your book and they're going to say, this guy's really idealistic here. Others will say, he's kind of a utopian thinker in terms of what he thinks can get done in the next few years. What's your response to those folks who say you're too hopeful?
Well, that's
Mr.
interesting because
Coyne?
I also get accused of being cynical and pessimistic. I'm certainly not painting a very pretty picture of Canadian democracy here. You're right. I'm idealistic enough to that it matters to me, but I'm not Pollyannish about how easy it will be to change any of this. And in fact, at several points in the book, I kind of confess that we're kind of caught in a vicious circle here, where many vicious circles, but one of which is in order to change anything, those changes could only be implemented by basically the Prime Minister, who benefits from the system as it is now. What grounds, therefore, do I have for optimism? I have two possible routes out of this. One is the sort of incremental one, which is you get the ball rolling somewhere. So, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of vicious circles that I describe, a couple of which I've mentioned. But the nature of a vicious circle is if you can twist it going the other way, it turns into a virtuous circle. So, if, for example, these MPs, let's say that becomes not just a practice, tentatively adopted by one party, but becomes the norm that MPs can remove their party leader. How does that change MPs' view of themselves? Do they start to see themselves as being a little more powerful, a little less, trod upon than they were in the past? Do they start thinking to themselves, you know what, I think I'd like to be able to ask my own questions in Parliament, thank you very much, now that I feel a bit more, sure of myself, and maybe they'll start to demand that. And maybe once they're asking their own questions in Parliament, maybe that leads to further reform. So part of this is trying to get MPs, as I mentioned off the top, to see themselves as what they should be, as independent representatives of the public who elected them, who happen to be members of a party, but who are nevertheless have a role and responsibility and a right to represent their constituents as they or their constituents see fit, and not simply be spokespeople for the party. So that's the incremental road, and we'll see. The other is we just get ourselves into such a terrible crisis that there's no alternative, and I'm very worried about this. We're in a stage right now where, by common consent, we've got to do a bunch of big things in a hurry. In some cases, these are things that we've neglected that we can no longer neglect, like defense, or there are things that have been pushed upon us by Donald Trump and by the whole change in our relationship with our largest trading partner, nearest neighbor, closest ally, and protector. That necessarily means major changes in the way in which we govern ourselves in this country across a whole range of policy fronts. Well, we've tended to avoid making those kinds of big decisions in a hurry in the past, partly because we're concerned that it would really cause great divisions in the country. What we have is a system where, as I say, governments get elected with quote-unquote majority governments with 37, 38% of the vote, most of it from one part of the country, which is the way the first-past-the-post system works, that it rewards your ability to clump your vote geographically. Okay, so that means you've pushed through some big thing, and the rest of the country goes, well, I didn't agree with that. Exhibit A would be the National Energy Program, right? The Liberals had 2 seats west of Ontario when they brought that in. 2 seats west of Ontario. They had 74 seats out of 75 in Quebec. Half their caucus was in that one province. If there'd been, this is somewhat parenthetical, but if we'd had a different electoral system if they'd had more representation in the West and fewer seats in Quebec and Ontario, if it had been spread more evenly, more in line with their actual vote, I very much doubt they would have done anything quite so
they'd be
radical.
hearing from constituents.
Exactly. But we have the system we have now. So my concern is, whereas maybe in the past governments might have shied away for that reason, they didn't want to divide the country. Now they're going to say to themselves, we've got no choice. We have to do these things for the sake of the country. They ram them home. They create huge divisions within the country, and at some point it just comes to an impasse.
So is a weird part of you hoping for a crisis to escalate because it would mean changes to some of the stuff we've talked about?
Well, I mean, no. I mean, I don't want the country to get into into that kind of impasse. I hope we can. This is part of the point of the book. Is I hope we can make changes without having to get into crisis. I mean, the fiscal crisis of the mid '90s. Sure, it caused us to balance our budget, but wouldn't it have been better if we'd balanced our budget before it was a crisis? So yeah, it can have that kind of backhanded benefit or silver lining, if you will, but I'd rather we didn't get into that. And if we understand where we're headed, maybe we can make the changes without it. But yeah, the optimistic scenario of that is 1864. The government of the province of Canada, the single province of Canada at that time, the Parliament was absolutely gridlocked. Nothing was getting done. Everything was at an impasse. Eventually, they looked at each other and they said, we're going to have to make these big changes that we've been putting off. And they formed the Grand Coalition and started the process of confederation.
Do we have enough dreamers these days, though? And do we have enough Canadians who are willing to sacrifice? You talk about sacrifice a lot in your book, that it's going to take sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if the country is able to do that en masse.
I think our history has been that while we put off things forever, when our backs are at the wall, when we have to make changes, I think our history shows that we do. We made the changes we needed to make to, fight the Depression. We made the changes we needed to make to fight World War II, and we made the changes in the 80s and 90s to fight the deficit that was about.
COVID might be a recent example.
Sure, exactly. We have a high trust society, and this is one. I mean, I talk a lot about the weaknesses of our institutions, and maybe I should have talked more about some of our enduring cultural strengths as a country. That we have not fallen apart the way the Americans have to anything like the same degree. We have divisions. We have regional divisions that our electoral system makes worse. We have social divisions similar to other countries, including the Americans, but they don't seem to have gone to the same degree. We don't have the same massive distrust of experts and expertise that they have in the United States. We don't treat each other across the partisan divide as enemies the way they do in the States. One of the things I think I've probably changed my mind on this. I think it's probably a strength rather than a weakness that so few Canadians belong to political parties. It's 2% of the public. Whereas in the States, virtually everybody is registered as either a Democrat or Republican or independent.
And that's what they talk about one another.
It becomes part of your identity. Mm-hmm. And I think it becomes very hard to make compromises and concessions, and it becomes very easy, particularly in this day and age, to view the other side as just being the devil. I don't think we're at that stage in Canada, and I think that's to our benefit and our strength that we can still have, I think, coherent discussions about these things. So yeah, I don't think it's impossible for us to roll up our sleeves and make these changes. It's finding the way into it, and that's where this get the ball rolling type of thing. I think the Reform Act, as limited as it was, as watered down as it was the start of something. And I think the removal of Aaron O'Toole, fine man though he is, I think was a watershed moment in the evolution of these things. I hope it will be anyway. I hope we'll look back and say bigger things started from that point.
It'd be interesting if that's if that is what he is remembered for.
Yeah.
You mentioned the people. Let's talk about the people. The populist anger, often on the right, that is often in your columns, often criticized. I wonder, as I was reading this book, is it not the byproduct of the failure of the system that we just described, in that the results aren't making their way to the people, and in response, you get that anger?
Yes.
So in some ways, you guys are kind of reading from the same songbooks. The lyrics are different, Andrew, but maybe you're reading from the same songbook.
Well, fair enough. I mean, I do think there's a price to be paid in one form or another for a system that just simply does not represent the public. And I'm not a populist in the sense of you should just take a poll and do whatever the poll says, But representative democracy, I'm very keen on the representative part of representative democracy. I think MPs should have real power to represent their constituents. So if the system doesn't respond, one consequence of that can be populist uprising, anger, support for extremist movements, et cetera. Another is just apathy and ennui and whatever other French word you want to throw in. And you see a lot of that in Canada, where one consequence of the lack of democratic legitimacy at the federal level is the feds don't dare take on the provinces because they fear that in any fight people will just sort of tribally stick with the government that's closest to them. And too many people, with some justice, look at the federal parliament and say, that's not my parliament, that's not my government, that's Ottawa. That's that far-off place that I send an MP to, and I never hear from him or her again. And as long as that's the attitude, then it's going to be very difficult to forge consensus and to make progress as a country. It's one of the sort of ironies is the more powerful the Prime Minister has become on Parliament Hill, the less powerful he's become off Parliament Hill. The more that we've centralized power in the Prime Minister's office, the less legitimate that the democratic legitimately the federal government is viewed as, then the less it can actually get stuff done in the country.
I'm wondering if you think apathy is ever a good thing. I have a friend who thinks that low voter turnout is often a sign of a healthy country, in that it means that your citizens, instead of what we see in war-torn countries in Africa, Latin America, you're forced to be paying attention to politics constantly. You're listening to your radio. Yeah. There's often danger and violence that can come out of their systems, democratic systems, we'll put in quotation marks. Is it ever a good thing that people can go about their daily lives and their democratic systems are ticking away in the background efficiently? Yeah. Is apathy ever good? Do you need to be so engaged?
I don't think I'll accept the premise that when times are bad, people pay more attention to politics. I agree with that. I'm not sure that's an argument for that times should be bad. And I'm not sure that it makes the case that because people don't turn out to our elections, it's simply a reflection that they think everything is ticking over nicely. It's not the evidence that comes out when they're polled and they're asked, why don't you vote? It's more like, my vote doesn't matter, they're all liars. It's much more cynical and that kind of response. So no, I don't think. The other thing you'll sometimes get people saying is, well, low voter turnout is a good thing in that it's a signaling device. So it's the opposite argument. It will signal discontent, and therefore governments will have to pay attention to that. Well, it's a nice theory. It conflicts with the theory that it's all just because they're so contented, but it doesn't seem to have worked, right? If that was supposed to signal we want change, then they're not getting it. So I do think low voter turnout is a problem. I think it's a problem, first of all, just in and of itself, that I think it does signal people don't feel the system is working for them. But the other important point is it's not just low voter turnout overall. It's lower voter turnout in some groups than others. You get an unrepresentative voting body. That it tends to be, youth vote less than older people. Racial minorities vote less than the majority. It's not distributed evenly. When we had the controversy over the long-form census, if you recall, where the Conservatives said, "Oh, it's okay. We'll have a voluntary census. That'll be fine." Well, every statistician stood up and said, "That's nonsense. If it's voluntary, it's not going to be a representative sample." The whole point of having a census, where you don't just do a polling size sample of 1,042 Canadians, you ask everybody. The whole point of why that's better than an ordinary poll is that you get everybody into the pool, and you only do that if it's compulsory. So I think one of the arguments for compulsory voting, mandatory voting, is to get a representative sample so that we're actually representing all the people and not just the people who happen to turn out. It's not just laziness or apathy that causes people not to turn out. It may be that they feel they're given all kinds of signals in most of their daily life that their opinion doesn't matter, that they're on the margins of society, that nobody needs to listen to them. Well, an election is the one day every 4 years where people have to listen to them. And it's a tragedy that they're not exercising that option. And I think we'd be a better and fairer society if government is supposed to be the greatest good for the greatest number. Surely to God, we should be getting everybody's vote in the election, which is a broader point that I'm trying to make about the Parliament. The Parliament is supposed to represent us. It's not representing us in terms of the MPs aren't representing us. It's not representing us in terms of who we elect and how they're elected. The first past the post system means that the only people who are elected in each riding, there's only one member per riding that's elected, and it's only the 30 or 40% that voted for that person who get represented in Parliament. I know that legally everyone's represented, but in terms of having their views represented in Parliament, which is the point of the exercise, we're only representing a slice of the public rather than all of the public. Why would we do that? I understand if there was some divine law that said you can only have one member per riding, then there would be nothing to be done about it, and everybody who complains about it should shut up. But if there's no such law, if it's possible to have more than one member per riding, let's say 5 members per riding, and if you could divide up the representation in rough proportion to the share of the vote that people got, why would we not do that? Why would we not want to represent virtually everybody rather than just somebody? Particularly when you look at all the knock-on effects from that one basic disproportion, when you start totting up all the other disproportions that come out of first past the post, when you aggregate those votes across all the ridings.
How do you solve for, though, it gets quite complex, and the public's willingness to listen and understand this stuff, the bar is very low. They're not willing to engage with the system we have already. Your thinking is that if you introduce a more complex one and somehow educate them in a way that they understand you'll be represented better, they will participate?
Well, how complicated is it really? Here's what
is it? Can it be put on a TikTok video for 5 seconds?
Well, here's what the single transferable vote is. It's instead of having one member per riding, you have several. And instead of marking an X, you mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the complication.
How you would sell
That's how complicated it is, right? I think we can manage it. The Irish seem to be able to do it. I think we can manage it. The counting is complicated, but it's I don't know how to fix my car, or I don't know how the engine works, but I can drive it fine. I don't need to worry about the complications of the counting. All I need to know is how do you run this thing? You mark a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Our system is tremendously complicated and tremendously unpredictable. We have no idea, when we look at the polling data on the eve of an election, we have no idea how it's going to pan out in terms of seats. We have no model that can actually do this in any successful way, because it's all these accidents of split votes. So if you want to talk about weird and wonky things, first past the post is mystifying in many ways.
So that's, in the book you're proposing ideas. I'm interested in you as a salesman. In a few weeks, if you got a call from a bunch of prominent Canadians and said, Andrew, we are going to sign you up to become a senator so that you can impose these views, you can impose these changes from the inside, what would your response to be on the other side of that telephone line?
No, thank you.
No, thank you. You want no part of entering this system.
Well, ever. I want certainly not as a senator. I don't think the Senate. I mean, I would prefer that we had a democratically elected Senate. That would be my first preference. I think it's virtually impossible to get there. So my second preference would be a radically watered down Senate. It's actually quite easy to get there. So the Senate was set up to be weak because that was the purpose of making them all appointed. The problem is that senators have not always obeyed the idea that because you're not elected, you should therefore not have any real power. They've become increasingly frisky in recent years because of the Trudeau reforms, where they were supposedly no longer partisan appointees. They were just appointed for their virtues.
Yes.
And in the early years of the Trudeau government, when there were a lot of conservative senators, there was a real danger that they were going to vote down
well, imagine if the Conservatives had won.
The Conservatives
the crisis we would have seen there.
Absolutely. And we've already seen rumblings in the Senate about how if the Conservatives brought in a bill that invoked the notwithstanding clause, that the Liberal senators, or the vast majority now, would vote it down. Liberally appointed senators would vote it down. Now, I'm no fan of the notwithstanding clause. I give a whole part of a chapter to it in this book. But I don't want the Senate to be the one that defeats it. But there's a very simple, I think, solution to the Senate riddle that to me would work fine, which is the Senate could pass its own resolution, a standing order that would simply say some version of, any bill passed by the House of Commons that is not passed by the Senate within 6 months shall be deemed to have passed. In other words, they would take away from themselves the right to veto legislation and therefore the right to impose amendments, because you can only oppose amendments with the threat of a veto. That would be a Senate that would only have moral authority, which actually is not, to me, is not a horrible idea. I think there is some power in the idea of gathering together some of the most respected citizens in the country, people of great accomplishment and positions in the community, there'd be power in having them not just as individual voices, but sitting in an assembly. But their power would be the power of their example and the power of their arguments and the power of their moral authority, not the formal authority to defeat government legislation. So if they behaved themselves sufficiently, if they earned and kept up that respect, then yes, if the Senate said, we don't like this bill, we think it should be changed, the government would, as a practical matter, would have to think very hard about it. That to me is a quite sophisticated sounding idea, but take away from them the actual power to defeat government legislation, which has no place in a democracy.
This is why you're a journalist. I asked you if you would become a senator, and you've somehow told me, how to fix the Senate.
I said off the top, I would never accept a Senate appointment.
So let's end on
you can quote me on that.
Okay, we're putting that in our pieces. Let's end on this, something more, lighthearted. The country is obviously deeply damaged. People can follow this sort of in the book, at least as it relates to our democratic system. But is there another country you'd rather live in on this earth?
That's a good question. I mean, we are a remarkably successful country. I am immensely proud of Canada and what it's achieved. I think we're one of the highest achievements of human statecraft. Are there countries that have done this or that thing better? Are there countries that have a better functioning electoral system? Yes. I think a lot of the European countries, whenever you talk about electoral reform or proportional representation, the first thing that comes out of some people's mouths is Israel, because they haven't thought about it more than 10 seconds. If they thought about it more than 10 seconds, they would realize there's 90-plus countries around the world that use proportional representation, including some of the best governed countries on earth. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, the Netherlands. These are all extremely well governed countries with very high performance on any measure you'd like. So, would I like to see that? Would I like to see a more traditional Westminster model, a la what still is the case in Australia, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand? I mean, they all have their defects and their ways in which they've become degraded, but you look across a number of different measures, they're still truer to the Westminster model, which I think is a really good model. I mean, this book is not proposing, in some ways, anything terribly radical. It's trying to get us back to the system we think we already have. Electoral reform would be a bigger difference, but even that's not that big a deal, as I explained, in terms of how it would actually affect how you vote. But mostly it's just trying to get back to the system we were taught in school.
But that we've never really had. You say that
we were closer to it.
We were closer to it.
We were much closer to it in the past.
The hill a bit.
Private members' bills used to get passed much more often in the past than they do now. They used to be much more part of a parliamentary business. MPs used to vote against the party line much more than they do now. Prime ministers have always been powerful. They were not as powerful as they are now. The cabinets were a bigger deal in the past than they are now. MPs were a bigger deal in the past than they are now. So, yes, we were never a perfect system. We were never absolutely in conformity, but we were closer to it in the past than we are today.
Well, here's hoping that in the future there'll be parliamentarians from other countries coming here to study what we do, saying, this is the best in the Western world. That is Andrew Coyne. His book, his first, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, is available in fine bookstores everywhere, and we thank him so much for joining us on Hub Dialogues.
Thanks, Harrison. That was great.